Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone is staying healthy and safe in this time of COVID-19. And thank you for joining us for our Soldiers Memorial Challenge Chat brought to you by STL History Live through the Missouri Historical Society. And thank you for finding yourself here. Our STL History Live programs are brought to you, especially the Soldiers Memorial Challenge Chats are brought to you by Beelman Truck Company, which is our sponsor for our challenge chats. The way our challenge chats work, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we have our presenter, who today will be my colleague and friend, Molly Codner, who's our archivist at the Missouri Historical Society, our Library and Research Center. All of you are currently muted, and but you will be able to ask questions. If you look down towards the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little box that says Q&A. If you click that box, you will be able to type in your questions. You can ask questions during the program and or at the end. And at the very end, myself and Molly will engage your questions and answer those live for you. If we are unable to get to all those questions, we will try to send you an email at the end of the program or within a couple of days to get back with those answers for you. We have closed captioning that is available to you. You will also see at the bottom of your screen a box that says CC for closed captioning. If you click that box, that will bring up the closed captioning for you. So if you need that assistance, that is also available to you. The program will last for about 30 to 40 minutes, and at the end, we will open it up for those questions and answers. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Molly Codner, archivist for her program, My Dear Molly, The Civil War Letters of Captain James E. Love. Molly?
Thank you so much, Marvin. Thank you for inviting me to participate in the Challenge Chat series. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to talk about this man, James E. Love. Most people have probably never heard, well, most people outside of his family have probably never heard of him, except for the fact that he left behind a collection of letters that he wrote to his beloved fiancée Molly that documented 4 extraordinary and grueling years in both his life and the history of the United States. The Missouri Historical Society has been privileged to have these letters as part of our archives for more than 50 years. I started as an intern at the Historical Society in 1997, right out of college, and my first job was to help one of the archivists compile a guide to the Civil War collections that we had. So I read many, many letters and diaries from both Union and Confederate soldiers, and I immediately believed that James's letters were special. Now, I will be the first to admit that this may have had something to do with the fact that I was a young, single, right out of college girl named Molly. And these were, in many cases, very romantic love letters written to my dear Molly. But I don't think your name has to be Molly to find these letters interesting. James wrote a total of 160 letters to Molly throughout the 4 years of the war. He often mentions receiving letters from Molly in return, but unfortunately her letters did not survive. So we only get James's side of the story, which is frustrating in some cases, and I'll point those out as we go along. But through his letters, in his own words, James documented not only the marches, battles, and hardships of his military service, but also his undying love for his dear Molly. And today I'm going to share examples of both parts of this story with you. So I want to begin by giving a little bit of background about James and Molly. James was born September 27th, 1830 in Bush Mills in County Antrim in Northern Ireland, which I circled here on the map. And I should point out that while he was born in Bush Mills, he actually grew up in a town called Ballymena, which is right here where I'm pointing. Both of James's parents died when he was fairly young, so James followed some of his aunts and uncles to America. He left from Liverpool, England on May 30th, 1849. He settled first in Cincinnati, and then he arrived in St. Louis in December of 1850. When he arrived, he worked as a clerk for several different grocers. And by the late 1850s, he owned his own grocery store and lived above the store that was located at the corner of what is now 9th and St. Louis Avenue, so about 5 blocks east of where Crown Candy Kitchen is today. Eliza Mary Wilson, or Molly as James called her, followed a similar path. She was born October 2nd, 1833 in Island McGee, also in County Antrim, in the center of the circle that I put on this map. Following the death of her father, Molly came to St. Louis around 1849 or 1850 with her mother, her aunt, several of her brothers, and a sister. Molly and her family lived at the corner at 804 9th Street, about 20 blocks south of James and near where the convention center now stands. James and Molly met sometime in the late 1850s. I don't know exactly how they met, but James's cousin Eliza Ann was married to Molly's brother William. And in 1861, James and Molly had fallen in love and were secretly engaged. I don't know why the engagement needed to be a secret. That's one part of the story that I don't know. But it was at Molly's insistence, a fact that emerges throughout the letters. When the Civil War started in April of 1861, James ardently supported the Union, and on May 11th of that year, he enlisted as a sergeant for 3 months of service with Company D of the 5th Regiment United States Reserve Corps. As tensions between the Union and Confederate supporters in the border state of Missouri increased, several regiments of federal troops headed to the capital of Jefferson City to take control of that city, including James's regiment. He left on June 15, 1861, and the following day, he wrote this letter to Molly. On board steamer D.A. January, Missouri River, June 16, 1861. My dear Molly, we are at present near St. Charles and en route for Jefferson City. I shall write you again from there. At present, I have only time to say how much I love you. All my hopes of heaven and earth depend on you. I have tried to act through life so that neither my own or my adopted country need be ashamed of me. I have a double incentive now, and with a little advice from you, I will try to never give you cause to blush for me. I hope and pray to return safe and soon. Believe me ever truly yours, in thought, word, and deed, James E. Love. From June to August of 1861, James traveled on steamboats up and down the Missouri River with his regiment. While James was not at the scene of battle in 1861, his letters provide a wonderful glimpse into life in the border state of Missouri, where he had some memorable encounters with the rebels, or Secesh, as James called them. The first encounter came when the regiment landed in Lexington, Missouri. James wrote, "We landed at once on our arrival, and on the double quick step, although we apprehended no trouble. We had a dress parade on the levee, and then started up the whole regiment to see the town and be seen. We had not reached the brow of the hill before we saw a lady waving a large secession flag, and this for over 10 minutes before we could believe our eyes. Then our mounted officers started over to take, across some vacant ground half a square off our line of march. We halted in battle array.
A crowd followed and surrounded our officers. The woman's husband rushed out and pointed a double-barreled rifle at the first, and for a moment there was every prospect of a row. But our leading officer stood firm, drew his revolver, and grasped the flag. Our friend with the rifle dropped it, or he was a dead man in 1 second, and so instead of a leaden warfare, we had only a woman's tongue, sharper than a two-edged sword, to contend with. James told Molly about another encounter with Missouri rebels in his letter dated August 3, 1861, when he describes going into a home in Hazel Hill, Missouri, not far from Lexington, looking for prisoners. He wrote, "We now searched the houses, the negroes as usual giving us every assistance and information when their owners were not by. We only found the prisoners, etc., aforesaid, and 10 saddles, besides several buckets of ice water and pans of ice milk, prepared for and partly drank by secession lips. As we had had none for hours, this we greedily drank at sight, fearing no poison. We meddled with nothing else, though the ladies were very insulting, and again cautioned us to let nothing stick to our fingers, suggesting that the plentiful supply of crinoline to be seen in the closets would be useful to some of us when in the course of the day it would be our turn to run. Acting very bravely, one especially, Miss Atkinson, talking and acting like a heroine, and when leaving with our prisoners she came towards them, and to one rather young and good-looking, whom we supposed to be her sweetheart, she said, 'Jemmy, be firm, let them do what they please, but never take the oath. If you do, I never want to see you again.' And to the other she said, 'And you too, Mr. Taylor.' But before we had gone 100 yards, she could not help screaming and crying. When some of the rear guard, not witnesses of the former scene, asked her what was the matter, she said, 'You are taking my friends, my dear friends.' And all this with such eloquent gestures and abandon that it was too pitiful to look at. She evidently never expected to see them again. We could give her no hope, and most came away sorrowful, many with a tear in their eye, for the first time awakened to the full horrors of civil war." I must say as an aside that the woman described in this letter always makes me think of Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind. So as I mentioned, the love story of James and Molly develops throughout these letters, and some of the letters are just good, old-fashioned love letters. James was committed to doing his part and fighting for the Union, but he desperately wanted to get home and marry Molly. On July 27, 1861, James told Molly about a dream he had. He wrote, "I dreamt long and pleasantly of you last night. What it may portend in an Irish point of view I leave for you to say, for I don't know. It was very much mixed and involved, and would require much more space to tell than I have left. But the main facts were these. We had got married, quietly and privately, all by ourselves. We had left a company of folks composed of your and my St. Louis friends, and also of my friends here and in this regiment, gone out for half an hour in broad daylight as if for a walk, and come in again. Sat down in a place which seemed alternately your parlor and this boat cabin as if nothing had happened, while I kept inventing excuses to talk with you in a corner where you sat demurely near a bright fire or stove, and at the same time I did not neglect any of the large company around, in order not to attract attention to our past absence or present conduct. Among other things, I went for a bucket of coals and mended the fire, and fingered the coal and knelt on one knee over the bucket to talk to you. It seemed to me I was playing host to the company, and I was in dreadful trouble as to how I was to break all the news to them, which I supposed I must needs to before nightfall, as we contemplated starting somewhere on the night train or boat. I believed to see the President, and perhaps instruct him how to carry on the war, while you gave his wife lessons in deportment." Now, in reading many of these letters, I wonder how Molly must have responded or felt when she read it, keeping in mind that these letters were the only way she knew what was happening to James. She had newspapers, certainly, but she didn't have 24-hour news or email or other forms of communication. So the delay must have been agonizing, especially after reading a letter like this. Lexington, 11 p.m., August 6, 1861. My dear Molly, we start in an hour on a dangerous expedition, and although I believe I have a charmed life as far as secession bullets are concerned, yet should I be wounded, I could not forgive myself if I did not write a letter now. Our secesh friends are trying to enclose us in a net, so that when we wish to go down in a few days when our time is up and reinforcements have come in, we may get caught. We go tonight to catch them napping if we can, and so destroy the net and the fishers who manage it. I know you wish us Godspeed and pray for us nightly, but even with a brilliant victory, some few lives may and will be lost. I hope to give a good account of myself as heretofore, and refer to Captain Hurd and my friends in Company D. I leave what will have to do for a will in my portmanteau. And now, my dear, dear girl, I am with kindest love to yourself and all, yours sincerely, James E. Love. 1,000 kisses. Fortunately, that part of James's service was not as dangerous as he assumed it was going to be. And by mid-August of 1861, his 3 months of service with the 5th United States Reserve Corps came to an end. He spent most of the latter half of 1861 in St. Louis and other parts of Missouri to recruit men for a new regiment. In early 1862, James and those men became Company K of the 8th Kansas Infantry Regiment. Their primary task in the beginning was to serve as border patrol along the Kansas-Missouri border. But finally, at the end of May 1862, James and the other men of his regiment left Kansas to join a large Union force trying to gain or maintain control of the Mississippi River and the states of Kentucky and Tennessee. James's first battle came at Perryville, Kentucky, on October 8, 1862, when a force of 55,000 Federal troops, led by Major General Don Carlos Buell, met the Confederate troops led by General Braxton Bragg. James wrote, Camp near Danville, October 10, 1862. My dear Molly, I scarcely know where to begin now, but we have seen the end of one bloody episode which may be called the Battle of Perryville, perhaps, though I don't know, it being a general engagement and covers so much ground. All our troops coming up on one side or other, and amid ominous preparations, with naught but ammunition, wagons, and cannon, we suddenly found ourselves in front of Bragg's whole army, drawn up in battle array, and the fight begun by the artillery on our side. We were all hidden away in ravines, so that we could not see or be seen, and also in the timber wherever possible, and we thus did not see a road for the next 3 days, and dare not go up on the hills even to look at the enemy. Towards 4 o'clock, the firing became fast and furious, and our companies had to be sent out as skirmishers to deter the enemy from taking our cannon. So it went on, momentarily getting hotter as we found out the position of the enemy, they keeping very quiet as if waiting to see where we were. Soon they seemed as if they wished to silence our cannon, the shots from which was annoying them very much, when we were at once formed in line of battle, first just behind the crest of the hill a few yards off the battery. Then we were moved into the woods on the left of it and away in front, but we did not get a shot, as another battery began to give them a crossfire of grape and canister, while they lay or marched through cornfields and mowed them down so fast that it got too hot for them, and they retired double quick, and also took their battery out of sight on the hill beyond. Before daylight on the 8th, we were in line of battle, but all hands were allowed to make small fires before sunrise so as to boil coffee. This we drank and eat from our haversacks, enjoying it much, being hungry. All this to still deceive the enemy as to our numbers. Then, what was the rear of our division yesterday marched at once to the front, and soon after sunrise, the fight begun at once, both fast and furious. Our division all formed in 3 lines of battle. We were in the 3rd line today, but the fight was so hotly contested all along for 10 miles or more that even our reserves were soon in it, or so close as to resist or charge themselves at any moment. So it went all day, with varied fortunes, sometimes we gaining, sometimes the enemy. Bloody work it was, everywhere, batteries charged on, taken and retaken, death in 1,000 shapes, and worse than death to many. Now, as part of my research on these letters, I visited all of the battlefields where James fought. So this is a picture that I took of the Perryville battlefield. And in his letter, James described how they were hiding in the valleys and in the timber. And I thought, how on earth could an army of tens of thousands of soldiers hide and not be seen? But when I visited the battlefield, I really saw how high the hills were, and that when you couldn't really see what was in the ravines. And I will also add that this battle ended up being a draw, partly because it was so windy there that it created an effect called an acoustic shadow. And the Union General Buell was camped a few miles away and did not even realize that a battle had started because the sound of the battle was being carried away from him. And the Confederate General Bragg left the battlefield. So this one didn't result in a winner or loser. Following that battle, James's regiment became part of the Army of the Cumberland, led by General William S. Rosecrans. And in mid-December 1862, the regiment moved to Nashville for provost duty, and the men remained in Nashville for the next 6 months. But the Confederate General Braxton Bragg and his forces were a constant threat in the area. By the end of December of 1862, the two sides met again at the Battle of Stones River or Murfreesboro, not far from Nashville. James and his regiment remained in Nashville, but he described what he heard about the battle. He wrote, "Oh, it is a horrid affair. Our brigade, the 32nd, and our division was under McCook and in the front, and it suffered the worst. We had just left it to come to town, so imagine the escape we had. They fought bravely, and General Woodruff, their commander, who has just come to town sick from the exposure and loss of sleep, compliments them highly. There is a dreadful loss of officers in their ranks. All parties unite in saying that General Woodruff fought like a tiger, while his adjutant was wounded and taken prisoner almost from beside him. He cried on the field while encouraging his men and rallying stragglers. At the time that his battery was taken, the captain and most of its men killed or prisoners, and he states that where his men fought, he could walk all over the field and step from one corpse to another. The dead of the 6 days' fight are mostly unburied yet, scattered over the ground 8 or 10 miles from right to left, and the same from front to rear, and still the fight progresses." So the image that's on the left of the screen is an image that I took of the battlefield. And the image on the right is the state capitol in Nashville, Tennessee, taken during the Civil War time period. So this is what it would have looked like when James was camped there. Ooh. I meant to not have done it. So after 6 months of provost duty, James and his regiment left Nashville in June of 1863, and James started what would become an eventful summer both in his personal life and his military service. James reached pivotal points in both parts of this story in the span of 2 months. Through June and July, James and the rest of Rosecrans's army marched through Tennessee in pursuit of Braxton Bragg's forces. At the same time, James anxiously awaited news from Molly, because he knew that Molly's family, especially her mother and brother William, now knew about their previously secret engagement. On July 25th, James wrote this letter after Molly told him that she wanted to break off their engagement. "Dearest Molly, for I will call you so once more, I cannot believe, but it is all a cruel dream. I've just received yours of the 26th June and 19th July a few hours since, and I am crazy, desperate. But is it true? Surely you deceive yourself. I know you well. I am sure you love me still. I cannot take no for an answer. My life, my happiness, now and forever is at stake. But I will not deal in words. I hope I love you too well to give you pain in any way. I release you freely from all engagements. I will begin anew, but in mercy deal candidly with me. Have no concealments. I have willingly had none. What have I done? What have I put in those letters that should change you so in one short week? I blame but myself, for you know I dislike secrecy and long engagements. Yet I meanly allowed myself to be persuaded. So now I can only bow to your wishes and declare you free. What have I done? I am tempted to desert my post a few days and see you. I am tempted to go see William and your mother face to face. But no, desertion is dishonor, is death, and mine is to be an honorable one. An enemy's bullet, I suppose. You shall never have cause to blush for me. What I have learned of the world, of women, and of a hereafter from you and my mother has made that resolution a fixed one. We shall always be friends. I shall, however, strive to be more, honorably, but you are free. Think of me also in kindness, for I will require it, rebelling as I intend to against your wishes, as I've not done heretofore. My letters may have shown vacillation of purpose, but never of love. But that vacillation was from one motive only, the fear of not being able to place you in the position you were entitled to. Perhaps it was cruel to ask you to tie yourself to poverty, to tie yourself to one who may be shot any day. But I had faith in the future. I have still. All must die, and in your love I feared not. If this is final, I fear less. I do not wish to live an old man. Fortunately, 2 days after writing that letter, James requested a leave of absence, which was granted, and he returned to St. Louis, arriving on August 5, 1863, the first time he had been home since June of 1862. Unfortunately, Molly was not in St. Louis at the time because she was visiting a brother in Washington, Illinois. However, James most likely met with Molly's family in St. Louis and then traveled to Washington to see Molly. By the time his leave was over on August 21st, I'm happy to say that James and Molly had resumed their engagement, and James was on his way to rejoining his regiment. So after successfully resolving that crisis in his personal life, James marched towards a much more serious turning point in his military service. While James was in St. Louis, General Rosecrans's army started movements toward Chattanooga, where Confederate General Braxton Bragg had gathered his troops. Rosecrans's troops first had to cross the Cumberland Mountains, marching 30 miles up and down the mountain. James had rejoined his regiment by the time they had to cross the Tennessee River, believing that enemy pickets were waiting for them on the other side. James's regiment was one of 2 regiments selected to cross the river first. The men were loaded into 25 boats with 25 men per boat and crossed the river, expecting shots from the hidden enemy at any time. One historian called the crossing the most hazardous undertaking known in warfare, the crossing of a wide, deep river in the face of an enemy. In his letter dated August 30th, 1863, James described the crossing. He wrote, "At daybreak, our brigade was ordered out, and each company marched down. Each captain got charge of a boat. At the word of command, the axemen cut down the brush in front, and the boats were at once launched down the steep bank and into the water. It was reported a battery was posted opposite, and we could see cavalry pickets on guard, so we were all braced for death and hot work. I had extra oarsmen named, and had all my officers instructed, so that if anyone fell, the others should go right straight along without delay. We got the word at once, and soon rushed the heavy pontoons down in the water and aboard, and then rowed for dear life. My boat was first in the water, but I did not wish to be over too soon, so I waited and took a fair start with some half-dozen. But my men being from St. Louis, and boatmen soon got ahead, and we were first across. It was an anxious moment, and all that could lay down close to the bottom in the water that leaked in. 50 or 60 large boats were crossing at once a river as wide as the Mississippi opposite St. Louis, but with little current. A grand sight to those who looked on, but all was quiet, save a few scattering shots, and nobody hurt. We had batteries and sharpshooters on the north bank ready to open on the Rebs as soon as they showed themselves, but they were surprised and scared, so that they rowed and ran off as fast as they could go. So fortunately no shots were fired, and the men reached the other side in about 10 minutes. They discovered that the enemy had already abandoned their camp. After crossing the river, James and the rest of Rosecrans's army began over 2 weeks of constant marches through the hills and valleys south of Chattanooga into northern Georgia. Rosecrans and Bragg constantly moved their armies, trying to determine each other's location and skirmishing repeatedly, both sides trying to get to Chattanooga to control that crucial city. By nightfall on September 18th, the two armies were on opposite sides of the Lafayette Road, which led to Chattanooga. Bragg's army on the east side of the road and Rosecrans's on the west. Due to the heavy woods along the road, neither army knew the exact location of the enemy. By this time, James was camped in a cornfield near Crawfish Spring. In September of 2013, I went to the Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park and the surrounding area for the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Chickamauga. The picture here is of the Crawfish Springs, where James was camped when he wrote this letter. Camp in Walker County, Georgia, between Chattanooga and Lafayette, September 19th, 63. Molly, dearest, I am very well, although very cold this morning, sitting in the sun by a fire with a blanket over my shoulders. I slept last night on corn stalks cut down where I lay. I crouched in the furrow to escape as far as possible the frosty night air with the fire alongside. Such is the sunny south, even in northern Georgia. Yesterday at this time I was hungry, but today I am well fed. We have been lying for 2 days in line of battle or as skirmishers, but have only heard a little distant firing. Bragg has evidently been reinforced and is coming back again. Only a short distance will he venture, for the Army of the Cumberland is once more before him. The whole army has moved and is rapidly concentrating in front of Chattanooga. All is again in motion this morning, as far as the eye can see as Rosie's troops or Bragg's campfires. We expect to move momentarily, and all are equipped and horses saddled for a rapid march or a fight if Bragg wishes it so. It is yet cold, dusty, dirty, and stormy, and the air is loaded with the smoke of houses, miles of fences, and tons of valuable army stores, so it is hard to compose an interesting letter to a lady. I only hope my dear girl is well and happy. If she is not so, the time will feel long to me until I join her to part and pain her no more. But if I am assured she is, it will pass quickly, and to I hope good purpose, and a happy issue at last. Fear not, the rebels hold not my life in their hands. I feel that in a few more months I will be with you again and a new man. And then, will we separate much for a long time? Not with my will, I assure you, unless by your advice. But hark, the bugle blows the assembly for a march and perhaps a fight. So I bid you a hurried adieu, but hope with God's help to address you again soon, with glorious news for the good cause. After writing his letter and hearing the bugle call for battle, James and his regiment marched north on the Lafayette Road for 8 miles toward battle. In his history of the 8th Kansas Infantry Regiment, Bill McFarland wrote of the march, "The first 3 or 4 miles of the 8-mile march to battle conjured up visions of marching through hell. Fence rails on either side of the road had been set on fire the previous night. The heat generated by the fires was, at times, almost intolerable, and the smoke drifted across the road, obscuring visibility. Dust from the road, churned up by the moving army, rose in thick clouds. So in the images that I have here, the image on the left is a map of the Chickamauga battlefield on September 19, 1863, and I put a red arrow on the map to show the location of James's 8-mile march from Crawfish Springs to an area known as Vineyard Field. The image on the right is a picture that I took of the Lafayette Road where James marched. As you can see, it is now a quiet 2-lane road, but you have to imagine that when James marched on it, it was a dirt road with fires burning on either side, and James and his regiment marched toward the constant thunder of cannon and artillery and the heaviest part of the fighting on the first day of the Battle of Chickamauga. I'm going to have to speed this up a little bit, I guess. So in the afternoon, James's regiment marched into the woods shown here. The regiment was in the center of the front line, and after marching almost a mile through dense woods, the troops faced repeated charges by the line after line of the Confederate Army. The regiment lost 5 captains, 3 lieutenants, and over 150 men shot down in less than half an hour. While on the extreme front, 2 balls hit James in the thigh, and he passed out. He awoke to the Confederate second line marching over him, a cannon fire hitting the trees around him, and an enemy soldier pressing a bayonet to his chest. Fortunately, a Confederate lieutenant from the hospital corps arrested the soldier, tied handkerchiefs above and below James's wounds, and moved James behind a tree and covered him with a rubber blanket. James left these woods as a prisoner, but he was alive. He remained on the field for 26 hours before he moved to a Confederate field hospital. He then spent 10 days at that field hospital, which was really just a cotton field with no medical personnel. A soldier from James's company, Private Fred Niederbracker, who was also wounded, tended to James's wounds and most likely saved his leg. All right, I'm going to have to skip through some of these a little bit, but James then wrote a letter from the field hospital. This was the first letter that Molly received from him since he had been wounded. After that, after 2 years of military service, James was wounded and a prisoner of the Confederate Army. On October 21st, 1863, he arrived at Libby Prison, shown here in Richmond, Virginia, and he was eventually moved to other prisons in Danville, Virginia, Macon, Georgia, Charleston, South Carolina, and Columbia, South Carolina. He was always in prisons for officers, which were better than prisoners such as Andersonville for enlisted men, but he was still a prisoner. And during the 16 months that he was in prison, James continued to write letters to Molly, although the letters were shorter and less frequent. Exchange and escape were James's 2 options for getting out of prison, and became a constant topic in his letters from prison. Unfortunately for James, the system of man-for-man, rank-for-rank general exchanges had ended in May of 1863, before James was even in prison. So I'll just briefly summarize since I'm running out of time, but his letters from prison just talk about the activities of life in prison. There was time for cooking. He talked about how the people would tell noises in the dark when all the lights were turned off. So to summarize, he spent 6 months at Libby Prison. He was then moved in July of 1864 to a prison at Camp Oglethorpe in Macon, Georgia, as William T. Sherman's army approached. As these riots moved toward Macon, Georgia, Confederate officials moved James and 400 prisoners to Charleston, South Carolina. During the train trips, James tried to escape several times. They cut holes in the floor of the train and ran out of underneath the train. Finally, by January of 1865, James was at a prison camp in Columbia, South Carolina called Camp Asylum. And just to mention the pictures here, the picture on the left is a drawing that was done of Camp Asylum. And in 2015, for the 150th anniversary, I visited Columbia, South Carolina, and got a tour of the grounds of Camp Asylum. And that wall in the right pan picture is the only thing remaining from that camp. So in February of 1865, as Sherman's troops were coming into Columbia, South Carolina, the Confederates moved James to his final prison, which was in Charlotte, North Carolina. And on February 16th, he wrote his final letter as Sherman's army entered. He wrote, "After writing the above, we were notified to pack for a move. We were marched to the cars and found all Columbia in excitement because Sherman was coming. We soon found we were bound for Charlotte, and after a tiresome ride of 18 hours, arrived here last night. It was an awful day and night. Rain sleeted and froze hard until the ground and trees were covered with an inch of ice. It was so rough I would not escape, though I had a good chance last night. We slept by a large fire in an open field. It was cold and foggy but dry. Today the same. Tonight, I intend to go, if possible, with a party of 8 for East Tennessee. Exchange news is good, but we have no faith and would rather cheat the Rebs if we can and carry our own letters. With love, farewell till I see you." So after writing that letter, after writing that last letter to Molly, James finally escaped from his Confederate captors while camped in a field near Charlotte. And he and a few other men crossed the mountains into Tennessee. And they got into a system of, similar to the Underground Railroad, of white men and women who supported the Union, free blacks and slaves who assisted the escaped prisoners and led them from one point to the next, providing food and shelter and hiding them when necessary. But after traveling 350 miles in 28 days, James reached Union lines and reported at Knoxville, Tennessee on March 14th of 1865. 2 days after reporting at Knoxville, James requested a leave of absence. I don't know the exact date of his arrival in St. Louis, but James and Molly got married at the First Presbyterian Church on May 2nd, 1865, and later that month he was honorably discharged. After an extraordinary story that included immigrating to the United States from Ireland and surviving 4 years of war, James had an ordinary, presumably happy life. James and Molly remained in St. Louis for the rest of their lives. They had 4 children, a boy and 3 girls. And James worked for various companies or as a cashier or clerk. James died at the age of 75 on December 27, 1905, more than 40 years after escaping from prison. Molly died at the age of 90 on April 1st, 1924. So this woman of the Civil War lived long enough to see cars and airplanes and electricity, and women get the vote, and her grandsons enlist during World War I. I don't know much about Molly except for the fact that, according to her great-grandson, she was a fervent prohibitionist. And James often mentions that he didn't drink the whiskey that they were having in camp, and I don't know that I believe that's true, but that's what he said. I don't know of any letters, diaries, or other papers documenting James and Molly's lives after the war. Most of the information that I got came from the census and city directories. So these letters are James and Molly's legacy, and I think it's a wonderful legacy, and I'm happy that I had the chance to share it with you all today. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly. I'm going to actually stop sharing real quick and pull up this last slide.
Oh, sorry about that, Marvin.
No problem. So again, thank you all for joining us. We do have some time for some questions and answers. And what you can do is, we do have some questions that have come in. A great question came in of how long would it take for James's letter to reach Molly back in the 1860s?
You know, I don't know that, I don't have a definite answer for that question because I don't know, you know, I don't have letters from her saying, oh, I just received this letter today. I would think that it would have varied pretty greatly from, you know, the time, because he was in the, you know, in Missouri. I would think that those would have gotten to her fairly quickly because he was on steamboats and they, you know, other boats came and picked up the letters fairly regularly. When he was on the battlefields, I would think it would also vary for a while. He was at headquarters working as assistant quartermaster adjutant, I can't remember which. I would think those would have gotten to her fairly quickly. The ones from prison, like I said, they were much less frequent, and I would think would have probably taken a while to get back to her.
Awesome, thank you for that. Another question is, how long did it take you to visit all of those James Love sites? Because that seems
it took a while. It took, you know, I visited Chickamauga actually several times. It was the last time I went there for the 150th anniversary that I really was able to take a tour specifically of where his regiment was. I guess I did one trip with my parents where we visited all of them, but I will also add that in 2015, after the book was published, I ended up going with my parents to Northern Ireland also to visit Bushmills and Ballymena and Island McGee. And Island McGee was the only place where I had the opportunity to actually follow in Molly's footsteps and stand in places where she would have been.
Awesome, thank you. Actually, a great comment came in that's from David Brown. This is, you can actually visit James and Molly today at Bellefontaine Cemetery. They're in the back corner by William Clark next to Edward Bates.
That is a very good point, and I have to say I've been to that gravesite several times, and one of the presentations that I did, they invited me to actually stand at their grave sites and read the letters, which was actually kind of an interesting experience to read these letters, kind of reading the letters to Molly. It was interesting.
There's another great question about ancestry. Do any of the descendants still live in St. Louis today?
They do not, and in fact, I think some of the James and Molly's, two of James and Molly's great grandchildren, I think, are listening. They live in Texas and Florida, and it was their branch of the family, their grandfather, James and Molly's grandson, that donated the letters to us. But no, none of their descendants live in St. Louis anymore.
There's another great question about, you said when the book was published. What book did you mean when the book was published?
So this started as the Missouri Historical Society, my project, posting the text of the letters 150 years to the day it was written, from 2011 to 2015. And after that project was done, the Missouri Historical Society published all of the letters as a book titled My Dear Molly, the same as the title of this presentation, My Dear Molly, the Civil War Letters of Captain James Love. And it is still available for sale. I think it's on Amazon. And it's at the Missouri Historical Society Museum, the Missouri History Museum gift shop, when we reopen to the public.
Not so shameless plug. This is
thank you. That's funny because I was going to put it on my bookshelf behind me, but I decided that would be too.
Yes, so not so. Even during quarantine, we still support our colleagues and their work.
Thanks, Marvin.
No problem. Let's see. Oh, what was the most challenging part of your research in editing these letters?
Oh my gosh. Well, I mean, Marvin and I were talking about this before, that James was definitely not a fan of punctuation and capitalization. So it was, he used often dashes rather than periods, and trying to figure out, in most cases in archives and transcribing documents, you want to be true to the document itself. But in this case, it just made it too hard to read the letters, to not have some punctuation. I think that was the hardest part. The second hardest part for me personally was that I did not have Molly's letters in return, and there were many instances. I mean, nobody wishes those letters still existed more than me.
Awesome, thank you. Another great question from.
Uh-oh.
Another great question came in. So we know that that Missouri was a border state, meaning it was a state that stayed in the Union, but it sent troops to fight for the Confederacy as well as sent troops to fight for the Union. And because James Love was part of the Missouri unit, was Missouri cleared of Confederate opposition by the time that his unit left the state and went further south? Or was there continued resistance and fighting in Missouri until the end of the war?
Oh, I think there was definitely continued fighting. And in fact, I think I'm right in saying this, that there were more battles and skirmishes fought in Missouri than any other state. So it definitely continued on. But I think, I used a couple examples of the letters that James wrote about the situation in Missouri, but there are many others. And it really gives, I think, the best picture that I know of in terms of what was going on. I mean, he didn't even talk about the battles. And at that time, he wasn't talking about Confederate soldiers. He was talking just about Southern sympathizers, or secessionists, as he called them, and his encounters with them. And there was one letter where he talked about how, residents would just come out with guns and shoot at their boat and then run back and go to their fields. So you didn't know who it was that was coming and shooting at them even. But yeah, the situation in Missouri was definitely not over when he moved on. It was just that his term of service ended.
Awesome. Yeah. So I think Missouri, I think rivals Virginia and Maryland in terms of battle sites and skirmishes during the war. And I think Tennessee maybe as well. But two more questions. We have time for about two more questions. This might be a quick one. Is there any guess as to why Molly wanted to keep the relationship secret?
No, again, that is, I mean, yes, I have guesses. I think that it is partly because, well, I mean, Molly, by that time, she was in her 30s. I mean, that was unusual for that time period to have a woman who had not been married yet. So that alone was unusual. And here she was engaged to a man who was getting ready to go off and fight a war, and could be killed at any time, and was not as well off as Molly's family. Molly's family, for people who live in St. Louis, lived in around where the Campbell House is, a very well-off part of St. Louis at that time, certainly. So those are my two guesses, but they're just guesses.
And a very friendly question comes in from one Ira Codner.
I don't know if I want to answer his question.
And Mr. Codner says, why would someone from another country choose to fight in our Civil War here in the United States?
Well, he became naturalized, and I don't talk about this. He became a naturalized citizen of the United States. I can't remember if it was in 1860 or 61. It was right before the war started. And he was, it was pretty much the president of his new home, President Lincoln, called and needed troops to fight this war, and he came to the call.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, to kind of a little bit follow up. I've had that question before at Soldiers Memorial because for those of you who've come to visit before, we do highlight James Love, as well as another Irish immigrant who fought for the Confederacy. And they're kind of highlighted side by side. And it really depended on your politics and where you were living at that time and the family that you associated with. For those Irish immigrants or immigrants who either married into unionist families or had more pro-union leanings, they tended to side with the Union. Those who married into pro-Confederate families or had more leanings towards holding people in bondage and slavery tended to side for the Confederacy. It really was localized. But thank you, Molly, for that. If we didn't have time to get to all your questions today, we will be in contact and we will send those questions to Molly and we will try to get those out to you. But again, thank you for joining us today at the Soldiers Memorial Challenge Chat, brought to you by STL History Live. At the end of this broadcast, if we would love if you could take a brief survey to tell us what we could do better and how you enjoyed today's program. If you're interested in becoming a member, please visit mohistory.org/support, and that allows you to make sure that we can keep these amazing programs going. Join us tomorrow at 6 p.m. for Vinyl Tales with DJ Wiz. That will also be brought to you by STL History Live, as well as Friday. We have a whole host of programs kind of ending out our week. For young families, we have storytelling. In the morning at 10 a.m., Peaceful Pals, followed by Cuentos. And Friday afternoon, we have James Eads, Beyond the Bridge. So those of you who are interested in architecture and also the Civil War, the famous St. Louis and James Eads will be discussed. And our next challenge chat will be on June 3rd at noon again, Dispatches from D-Day, hearing the original letters from those men and women who were there on D-Day to remember the 75th anniversary of the D-Day landings. So thank you all for joining us today for another amazing challenge chat. And we'll see you all next time. Thank you, Molly.
Thank you.